guest with a shawl and flowers. Mrs. Usha Singh will present a memento to our honorable guest. Thank you so much. We cannot wait to hear you, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Sugata Mitra for you.
Well, good morning, and it's such a pleasure to speak in Kolkata. I speak all over the place, but when I speak here, I know that I'm speaking in the city where I was born and where I lived through my childhood. So it's a different kind of feeling. What I want to talk to you about is actually about the future, not so much of education, but the future of learning. If you make a distinction between the two, I mean, learning is, I guess, what eventually results in an education, but the two things are separate from each other. We learn in many different ways, and we have educational institutions which make it possible for us to learn. But is the nature of learning itself immutable, or has it changed with time? So let me take you through a story which spans almost 20 years of experiments throughout the world. I have a presentation there which maybe you can put up now. Okay, do you have a clicker or something to move forward and back? How do I move forward and back on the right? Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so as I said, it's about 20 years of work, and for those of you who are school leaders and school teachers, and perhaps the students sitting here, you might find certain aspects of these experiments of interest to your own circumstance. And I would be very happy if at the end of this you could take away some ideas that you might be able to use in your own institutions. Before I go further, I'm going to just ask you to keep a look at that picture. I'm not going to say anything about it. You can make out what it is. It's a drop, and there's a body of water. Since there are ripples in the body of water, presumably it's not the first drop that fell in. It might be a subsequent drop. Whatever it is, just keep that picture in mind. But let's go back in time 20 years. Let's see. Yeah. We go back 20 years to an experiment which I did in 1999 in Delhi. An experiment that the press called, the Times of India actually called it, the hole in the wall. The experiment was very simple. You must remember that back then in the 1990s, there were children who had never seen a computer or who had never heard of the internet. It's hard to imagine today, but that's how it was 20 years ago. There were people, children of richer parents who had access sometimes to computers, but not many. And of course, there were millions of children who had no access at all. I decided to test what would happen if children who had never seen a computer before or never heard of the internet, what would happen if they were just confronted with it? And people said, why do you want to do that? And I said, because we cannot have a situation where we have enough schools and enough teachers to actually tell the children anything about information technology. So should we then just give up and say, well, nothing can be done? Or why not see what would happen if I just showed them a computer? Back in those days, nobody thought this was a good experiment because they said, nothing's going to happen. I mean, this is a complicated machine. It's a complex idea. You need a teacher to be there to tell the children what to do. I did the experiment in the January of 1999, and in Delhi, it was done in an area of Delhi called Kalkaji. There was a slum there with lots of children and a boundary wall which separated the slum from the road. So I made a sort of an opening in that wall, pushed a computer into that opening. It was running Windows, whatever version of those days, and it had the internet and a touchpad next to it, and turned it on. Now when I did that, children obviously came rushing and sort of surrounded the whole thing. But I noticed something peculiar. They didn't do anything. They just stood there. So I thought, well, this is disappointing. I mean, where is this going to go? Because nothing is happening. At that point, I realized something rather important about education. I hesitate to say this to an audience such as yourselves, but I realized that the presence of an adult figure, such as myself, standing there and looking down at the children, was preventing them from trying anything new. So I thought, oh my goodness, so it is not because of the computer that they're not touching it, it's because of me. So I turned around and I walked off. And as soon as I did that, I heard the voices of children behind me. And by the end of the day, we found the children surfing, looking at websites, and people said, how are they doing this? Who taught them? And I said, I don't know. It seems that nobody taught them. What language are they doing this in? Well, it looks like English, but they're not supposed to know any English. So how is this possible? It was a big mystery. That is the story of the hole in the wall. Over a period of a few months, I started to notice that the children were doing more and more complex things. For example, they would find a game on the internet, download it, install it in the computer, and then play it. And people said, that's impossible. Who is teaching them? I still didn't have an answer. Here are some videos from those days. That's the structure which got called the hole in the wall. This is one of the first days. This little boy on the right, he was 8 years old. To his left, his student, who is 6, and he was teaching her how to browse. And then hundreds and hundreds of children. The Delhi government put 30 of these in various slums in Delhi. And everywhere we saw the same things happening. The World Bank funded me to repeat this experiment all across the length and breadth of India. It took 5 years to complete this experiment. The experiment was that at each place, I would take a random sample of children and I would test them for computer literacy over periods of time. And at the end of it, bring all that data back to my office and see what it's saying. What we learned was this. Now, I know that you will say, well, this is very well known. Everybody knows this now. But nobody knew it then. This is the first experiment that actually established the fact that children can learn to use the internet on their own, provided, and these are very important conditions, provided they work in heterogeneous groups, groups of boys and girls, provided they are unsupervised. Okay, very important. If there's a supervisor, they will not try anything new on their own. And thirdly, and this I think is the most important of the conditions, the internet must be provided on a large, publicly visible screen. Both conditions are important. The screen must be large. Why? So that you can see what's on it from a distance. It must be publicly visible. Why? So that when a child is working on the computer, on the internet, he or she or they know that anyone passing behind can see what they're doing. It's under those circumstances that I found that rapid learning would happen without any intervention. So everybody got interested because, you know, teaching and learning is considered an institutional activity. You need an institution, you need teachers, you need a subject, and then it happens. But here, it was happening on the streets, and it was happening by itself. Is that a viable method? And the big question continued, who is teaching them? And I said, I don't know. I brought this method to England in 2006. In England, I worked for Newcastle University, which is, you know, if you think of the map of England, it's kind of almost close to the Scottish border. And Newcastle is a town next to this river called the Tyne. So it's called Newcastle upon Tyne. Now on the other side of the river is another city. It's called Gateshead. And Gateshead is somewhat poorer part of England, of northeastern England. There is some amount of unemployment and that sort of thing. So it's economically a bit depressed. So I started going to the schools of northeastern England and reproducing the hole in the wall. Now, how do you reproduce the hole in the wall inside a school? Well, you don't need a wall and you don't need a hole in it. It's very simple. Anybody can do this. Take a classroom, put in, let's say, 5 computers with reasonably big screens. So 5 of them. Keep them in the classroom so that standing anywhere in the classroom, you can see all 5 screens. Now bring in about 4 times the number of computers, bring in that many children. So if there are 5 computers, bring in about 20 children. And ask them a question. The computers, of course, should be connected to the internet. Ask them anything, anything at all. Make it an interesting question so that the children will sort of engage with it. And then you just stand back. You don't do anything. In fact, it works very well if you say to the children, I don't know the answer. So what happens then is what you see on the screen. You know, a lot of teachers ask me, should I ask the children to make groups? And I tell them, no. Because if there are 5 computers and 20 children, what else can they do? So they will make groups, except that they will make groups on their own. They will decide who will be in which group. They will change their groups if they need to, and so on. Once I started doing these experiments, I quickly realized that the children are able to answer very complex questions. You know, by the way, since I'm in Kolkata, I can tell you this story. In one of the Gateshead schools, the children were asking me, where are you from? So I said, I'm from India. I'm from a city called Calcutta on the eastern coast. And they said, so what's it like? And I said, well, I'm not going to tell you, but I'll give you a question. Can you tell me what is Durga Puja? And they said, what? So I said, Durga Puja, I'll write it for you. So I wrote it on the board. And they said, what is that? And I said, well, that's what I'm asking you. And I sat down. And within about 30 minutes or so, what you just saw on stage happened in the Gateshead school with 9-year-olds. They said, this is a myth from a long time ago. It's about good versus evil, and there's this demon who is dressed up as a buffalo, and etc., etc., the whole story. And I was with my school teacher friend, Emma. So I was telling Emma that, look, you could have taught this. It would have just been a boring lesson from some faraway land. Instead of that, I just did the same thing in 25 minutes. And they'll remember this lesson that they taught themselves. They'll remember it forever. So we gave this method a name. We called it, sorry, go on ahead. Can you go back once? We called it a self-organized learning environment, or SOLE, S-O-L-E. And the name's kind of obvious. It's organized internally by the children themselves. So what is a SOLE? Well, basically you set up a few computers, screens are large, publicly visible, heterogeneous groups. You see all those 3 conditions that I had learned in India, brought into the classroom. Ask a big question, wait for about 30 minutes, and then have the children present an answer. Not individually, but as a group. So you tell the children, this is not a competition, this is not an exam. I only want to know what the answer is from all of you. I'm not interested in who is telling me the answer, who is not able to, none of that. Then you'll see the richness of the information that the soul produces.
Yes, he's my cousin.
Yes, he's my cousin.
Cezanne was his second name and Paul was his first name. He was French. He was born in 1839 and he died in 1906.
El mundo se va a terminar porque el mundo va a girar muy rápido y va a haber destrozos naturales.
That last bit was from South America. So the reason I showed you this is because what happened next was quite interesting. The English school teachers started to talk amongst themselves in the staff room about souls and said, you know, this is a very interesting way because, and they would joke about it and say, if you haven't prepared for your lesson, just do a Sugata Mitra on the children and you'll get some very interesting results. Word started traveling. I started getting invited to speak about it at different places. It spread from England all the way down into Australia, then into Latin America, the Spanish-speaking world, Argentina, Chile, Bolivia, up to Brazil, Mexico, finally into the United States. And everywhere, we would get the same results. A few years of experiments later, I had to write this. Now I know that this is a very dramatic statement to write. Children in souls can learn anything by themselves. Now my colleagues at Newcastle University started to become very critical. And they said, you know, you're going beyond the limit. What do you mean by anything? There has to be a point at which it would stop, you know. It depends on what you're asking them. So I started doing a whole set of experiments on what the limits could be to such self-organized environments. I did experiments, particularly one experiment in the Pondicherry district in South India, where I gave 12-year-old Tamil-speaking children material on DNA replication and biotechnology in English at the university level. And they were able to get about 30%, 30 out of 100 in a test. And I said, what does that mean? 12-year-old children who don't even understand English properly are answering this university level question just because you're allowing them to cluster around the internet. What does that mean for education? Remember the three conditions: heterogeneous groups, publicly visible internet, and take away the supervision. So I said there doesn't seem to be a limit. But then 30% is not such a good score, not very good. So I thought, well, how can I raise the score further? And I thought of a method. I can't get a teacher. I can't get a teacher in a place like the village I was doing the experiment in on biotechnology. So what can I do without a teacher? Well, I thought we can use what I called the method of the grandmother. It's, you know, the stereotypical grandmother. What does she do? She says to the grandchild, "That's wonderful. How did you do that? When I was your age, I could have never done that. You're really clever." And the child says, "Oh, that's nothing. Let me show you something more." The grandmother's method uses admiration as a pedagogic instrument as opposed to discipline. I wrote an article in the Guardian newspaper in England saying, if you have an internet connection and a web camera, can you give me 1 hour of your time every week for free? And I got hundreds and hundreds of them, people who said, yes, we are interested. But before I come to that part of the story of what these people did, let me tell you a little piece about the answer to that question: how is this form of learning happening? Where is the learning happening from? And to explain that, I would need to turn to my old subject, physics, to talk about something that physicists and mathematicians have known for a long time: self-organizing systems. What is a self-organizing system? Well, if you look at that, now that's a flock of birds, and they're making a shape. You can see that on summer months if you look at these big flocks of birds. Now, if I were to ask you, how does an individual bird know what to do? How do they make a shape? Who tells them? Well, the answer is that there isn't any supervisor. There is no supervising body. It's happening by itself. But how can it happen by itself? How are you getting order from nowhere without any supervision? Well, nature is full of it. A flower or a cloud or a thunderstorm doesn't have a manager or a designer to make it. It happens by itself. They are all self-organizing systems. A beehive, you know, those perfect hexagons, that bees make. Well, what does an individual bee know about geometry or hexagons? Nothing. But 10,000 of them together can build this perfect hive, a self-organizing system. In physics, we have a name for it. It's a nice romantic name, actually. It's called spontaneous order. And you can see it almost anywhere. You can even see it in chaotic situations like an intersection where the traffic lights have failed. Now you might think that, okay, so everybody's going to stop and there's a chaos. There is, but only for some time. After that, you find that the traffic is flowing. Some are going right, some are going left, some are stopping, waiting, moving. If you take a speeded up camera view, movie of that situation, you get something really strange. It looks as though there is an invisible traffic light which is turning on and off. Spontaneous order. So could this be what was happening in the self-organized learning environments and the hole in the wall? I started to experiment with it. I started to read up on the mathematics of how such systems work. Okay, we'll come back to that water drop we saw for a moment. And I was asking you at that time, just keep it in your mind, what is it? Well, take a look again. I go back and forward. So you see, it wasn't a drop falling in, it was a drop falling out. The first drop fell in, the body of water reacted to it, remembered the shape and size of that original drop that fell in, and reproduced it perfectly and threw it back at you. Could that be a mechanism of learning that we don't deal with normally? Is this what is happening in a self-organizing system of children, where we throw in a question and the answer pops back at you from inside? Sort of matches quite neatly with Swamiji's opening statement of the light from inside. Okay? Is this a way to make that happen? So teachers started to ask me, well, does this mean that we don't have a job anymore? And I said, no, it's definitely not, because who is going to make the question? You know, I'm not saying that you should just have chaos inside your school with children and computers and internet and nobody around. That's not the point. The point is that you drive the system with a question, with that drop of water to start with. But then, you don't do anything more after that. You just stand back. The one line that teachers are beginning to use all over the world now is what you see on the screen. Your instruction to your children, you go there, I'll go with you. What else can you say to a generation that's entering into the internet? Do you know what they're going to encounter out there? Do you know what is there? It's bigger than anything that we have ever imagined. What else can you say except to say, you go there, I'll go with you. So back to the story of the grandmother. I got my hundreds of volunteers from Britain, and they said, what are we supposed to do? And I said, well, I'm going to beam you using Skype into remote areas and schools where they don't have any teachers, or they don't have really good teachers, etc. And you're not supposed to teach, because it's very boring if you come on a screen and start teaching. Don't teach. Put that first drop in. put an idea in and then say, I'll come back later, you go there, and I want to see what you find. We gave this group a name, although, mind you, that group has men and women, young women, they're not all grandmothers, but they gave themselves a name. They called themselves the Granny Cloud. So the Granny Cloud sits up there, and when you have a remote area school, or when you have any school for that matter, you can get one of them to come in there and to drop in that big question. Hang on. Just go back one. And this one's a film clip there. One step. Yeah, just leave it. It's an example from my office. The sound. Oops, sorry, we don't have the sound there. So we'll just skip that and go forward. The idea is that she is not teaching them. They're both reading a poem together. And what you can see in that clip, which I see very often, is whatever else it does, it changes the accents and the pronunciations of the children very rapidly. Because, children tend to just copy whoever they're talking to. So I find that in remote areas, but not in the big schools such as the ones that you teach in, where you have excellent English teachers, but in those places where you don't, this is a very rapid and easy way for acquisition of English with correct grammar and pronunciation. So basically, admiration, if used correctly, can produce spontaneous order in a group of children. So in 2013, I got this prize. It's called the TED Prize, and it was a lot of money. So I gave the money to my university in Newcastle and decided to do an experiment with it, to bring two ideas together. The idea of the self-organized learning environment and the idea of the Granny Cloud, and put them together into one single facility. And we would give it a name. We would call it the School in the Cloud. Just go back one. We would call it the School in the Cloud. So the School in the Cloud is not a website. Okay, it's a physical space, except that it is steeped in the internet. The internet runs the whole show inside there. And you have the Granny Cloud to tell the children what's an interesting thing to try. I built 7 of them, 5 in India and 2 in England, going all the way from the remotest area that I could find into urban middle-class India. The remotest one that I have today is in a village called Korakati in the Sundarbans. There's no electricity, there's no healthcare, there's literally nothing there actually. And I built a facility there, which is a glass structure, solar powered, air conditioned, with 4G internet connectivity, and that was the remotest of the lot. Then I built one in Midnapur, one more in near Baruipur, one in Delhi, and one in Fulton, Maharashtra. And then in England, I built one in a town called Killingworth, and another in a village called Newton Aycliffe. And over a 3-year period, we studied what would happen there. What happens to the children in that environment? Here are some, in the meanwhile, by the way, people from all around the world started building these schools in the cloud everywhere. They didn't wait for me, for my results. They said, no, we know what you're talking about. We'll just go ahead and implement. So here are some pictures. Newton Aycliffe, then Killingworth in England. Now you see the design there. Large screens, visible. The possibility of a lecture is not there. There are no rows and rows of chairs and tables. There's reconfigurable furniture. So the room kind of lends itself to self-organized learning. This is Harlem in New York, in the sort of poorer and disturbed area of New York. A very simple implementation there. Everything's at floor level, so there's no furniture cost. The children sit on carpets, they have pillows if they want to lean or whatever. And they have actually 4 computers, of which you can see 3 in this picture. This is, I just recently opened this just about a week ago in Suzhou in China. A beautiful, absolutely beautiful arrangement there. Created by an English school teacher along with her Chinese colleagues. And what a marvelous feat of design it is. So I opened it and I sort of worked with the children there for a couple of days. In Punjab, the government took an initiative after I did an experiment in a village called Sidhuwal. You can see again the design there, all the computers highly visible, children at floor level. By the way, they didn't have money for painting. So I got some paint and I gave it to the children and I said, you paint it. And just look at what they did, that fantastic design on the wall. The government of Punjab looked at their, the rate at which they were learning English and decided to make another 56 of these in the villages in Punjab. Those have already been inaugurated this month, so I'm kind of eager to find out what happens next. This is Korakati, the remotest of the lot in the Sundarbans. The children speak, 3 years later, the children speak in reasonably good English. They're extremely good at searching. Their reading comprehension skills have gone up, and they don't have a teacher at all. They're completely self-regulated. I used all the lessons that I learned and put together what is the cheapest way to do this. Cheapest and the most efficient way to do this. I implemented it a year ago in a village called Doshkhara, close to Tarakeshwar in West Bengal. And it's 24 children can come in there. It's a facility in their playgrounds. So just as the playground is for playing, football or whatever it is, this is their playground in cyberspace. This is typical of what happens in there, the kind of activity that happens. So it's really very simple. There's a supervisor there. In the morning, he just opens it, lets the children come in. If there is a granny, cloud granny session organized, then he makes the connection, or the children make the connection. And then he just leaves them alone. And in the evening, we close it before sunset. So what did we find in those 3 years' time? Well, 3 basic things. 3 things happen in this kind of a free, self-organizing environment. First thing, you don't need to teach children how to use a device. So if you've got a new device in the school, You don't need to organize classes to say, now this is how you have to use it. Just give it to them. These experiments show that it will always work that way. The second thing, their ability to search on the internet goes up over a period of time, over a period of about 2 years. They begin to understand how to detect wrong information from right information. And I think you'll agree that this is one of the most vital life skills of our century, of the future that you are preparing those children for. They get protected against the internet by teaching themselves how to search properly. And thirdly, quite interestingly, their reading comprehension goes up. Why does it go up? Well, there is no teacher, first of all. Secondly, the internet doesn't know that they are children, so the internet throws everything it has at them. The children don't know what they are supposed to be able to read and what they are not supposed to be able to read, so they read everything. Over a period of time, their reading comprehension in English goes up dramatically. I've seen it in all the sites that I experimented in. So, basically, schools in the cloud will improve reading comprehension, improve a sense of well-being, cause learning with good quality retention because they're doing it themselves, will improve communication and collaboration, and it has a fairly dramatic change on teachers as they observe this happening to their own children. So that was all the good news, and in the last few slides here, I have to talk to you about the bad news. There is a system out there. Okay, we are all parts of it. And this is the end point of that system, the examination. So, what is the examination? You are alone. You don't have any assistive technology. You're given a piece of paper and pencil. You're asked a question, and you must answer it using your head and nothing else. You mustn't talk to anybody. You mustn't look at anybody else. Why? Is that how you would live your life when you go out there in the street, when you go out there on your regular work? Are you alone? Are you not allowed to talk to anyone? Are you not allowed to use the internet? Do you have to answer every question by yourself using your memory? Then why do we test them for this? I got very curious to understand why it is like this. And the answer lies in history. There was a time when it was important that you should be able to understand an instruction, work alone, not talk to anybody, do arithmetic in your head, have good handwriting, and then you would be successful. The 1920s. The entire world used to be run using these systems. There were no computers. Here were people who were doing the work of a computer. So how do we change that? Or when do we change it? These are the offices your children will go to. So shouldn't we prepare them for this kind of an office? This should be what an examination looks like, not the other kind of picture that I showed you. Use of the internet, just go back one step. The use of the internet should be allowed during examinations. Those experiments are just beginning in the Scandinavian countries, but we could lead if we wanted to do it from now. The internet should be a subject in schools. Why do you expect the children to learn how to use the internet in the street and stop it from entering the school? It should be taught like a subject, like physics or chemistry. What is it? Who owns it? What's wrong with it? What's right with it? What's the engineering design? It should be a part of school. Comprehension, communication, and computing should be the key outcomes of schooling today, instead of or subsuming reading, writing, and arithmetic. The purpose of education, I think you'll all agree, is to produce happy, healthy, and useful people. So this is what I have to say. This is the last slide. Introduce the internet as a formal subject, even before the government asks you to. Introduce complex dynamical systems, self-organizing systems, into the school. It's the new physics of tomorrow. It has to be taught from now if you want your children to lead. Divide the existing curriculum into 3 parts. First part, things that you need to live. Second part, things that are good to know, interesting to know. Third part, things that will come in the exam. Teach the third part and ask the children to forget it after the exam. And finally, allow the use of the internet during examinations. I spoke a couple of days back in Sun City School in Gurgaon, where there were, I think, about 600 children sitting at the back. When I brought that last point in, they all rose all together and started clapping. I think if we took these steps from now, we might just get there before everybody else does. I would like to see that happen here in this country, from where all this had started. Thank you.